afternoon, everybody. Happy Thursday. It's springtime, I hear. Hope you all are doing well. It's great to see everybody. I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Noel Woolard. She is a colleague of mine at BCU Autism Center for Excellence. And she and her colleague from years past are going to be talking about evidence-based strategies that promote social emotional learning, one of my favorite topics. So without further ado, go ahead, Noel, and let's get going.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you, Stacy. So welcome everybody to our session on evidence-based strategies that promote social and emotional learning. My name is Noel Woolard. I'm a technical assistance associate at the Autism Center for Excellence at BCU. And I am joined today by my friend and colleague, Dr. William Ketterer, who's a clinical psychologist, and he's also the owner of a consulting business named Ketterer Consultants. He supports school divisions in Vermont and New Hampshire, specific to educational programming, as well as doing some training for those school divisions on social and emotional learning. He's also an award-winning author of a book that is titled Reducing Anger and Violence in School, an Evidence-Based Approach, which he won an award from the APA in 2021 for. So we're very excited to have him with us today on this session and to give us a little bit of his expertise and share that with the folks of Virginia. So I'm going to try to move my slide. Let's see. And I always love these first slides in Zoom because sometimes it takes a while to get things moving. There we go. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping before we start. We typically record these sessions so that folks who were not able to participate today can participate at a later time. We do also have all of our lunch and learn sessions archived on our website for folks to go back and view at a later time. With you just logging in at this point, you are basically saying it's okay for us to record you within the session, but before this session is distributed or sent out in a link or on our website, we will remove any information that identifies you as a person just to protect privacy. Stacy is going to be manning our Q&A session. That's at the very end. She's also going to be kind of manning our chat session. So if you have any questions during this presentation, you can go ahead and type those in the chat, and she'll either interrupt us as we're speaking and ask us a question, or she'll hold it till the end. Anything that you type in the chat will be included within the transcript of this session, but your name will be removed from it. So we will make sure to uphold your confidentiality. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ketterer to kind of get things started. He's going to unmute, I think.
Hello, can everyone hear? Can you hear me? Thank you so much for those warm words, Dr. Woolard. I'm very, very happy to be here, and it is an honor to be asked to participate in this lunch and learn. And I want to thank everyone for taking a moment out of their very busy day, I imagine, to spend some time with us. And as Dr. Woolard has told me, many of the folks may be working in direct care with students. And my hope is that for the next 45 minutes, you can maybe have some time to reflect on these ideas and maybe get a break from the hard work that you do. So that's first, and I am very, very pleased. I also hope that what I have to say may be of use to you and may be interesting. Dr. Woolard and I approach things from a slightly different perspective. So some of the things I may be introducing to you may be new. And if you have any questions, please ask them. Dr. Woolard has assured me we have time for that. And I get wrapped up in these ideas. So if I speak too much, Dr. Woolard, please tell me to stop. But what I was asked to do today was to talk a little bit about evidence-based practices regarding social and emotional social and emotional development. Children, how do children develop? And these are some of the things that I'd like to talk to you about today. How do children develop self-control? What are some of the implications for children returning to school following COVID-19 school closures? And what are some social emotional considerations for us to consider in regards of how children develop self-control? And then, thank you. I don't want to read off the slides, but after the COVID-19 school closures, we really didn't know how students were going to return to school. And these are some of the questions that we had, because if, as we all know, COVID-19 and the school closures changed things for many, many students. Our questions were, we didn't really know.
So I think one of the things, if I could just jump in real quick, from a Virginia perspective, this was one of the questions that we had pretty much in every team meeting that we had, pretty much right after everything closed down. We knew that some kids were coming into school and they may be learning, but their learning environments looked very different than they had before COVID. And then we knew a lot of kids were actually staying at home and they were not having access to direct instruction from their teachers. So one of the questions that we had on our team was, when students return back to school, would we find that they were missing some of those prerequisite learning to learn skills that are essential for being a really good learner? Would we have students that miss some of those prerequisite math and reading or literacy skills that were essential for them to be successful in those reading and math curriculums? So we knew that there were things that kids were not going to have been exposed to and things that kids were not going to learn. And we were worried about how that might impact how they would return to school and the behaviors that we would see.
Thank you. But there are some things that we think we know. Now, we know that science doesn't really know anything. Science questions things. A hypothesis is a question. But what we think we know in 2020 is how children develop emotional regulation, how they develop resiliency, how they develop healthy engagement, and how can children develop the capacity to heal from emotional trauma. The way children develop emotional control is through relationships. Relationships with other people is the key. Oh yeah, we also know that what defines an evidence-based practice, and we also know a little bit about the brain. And brain science continually reinforces the importance of relationships. Human beings are built, if you will, to connect to other people. There's I'm speaking to you from outside Dartmouth, and some of the Dartmouth neurologists are working very hard to localize some of the parts of the brain that are fundamental and are the importance of relationships. So that's what we know. We know the relationship is what counts. And yeah, the student-teacher relationship is the most important tool in helping children develop the capacity to regulate their emotions, to self-soothe. It can also build the student's capacity for other relationships with other adults, as well as peer relationships. And even arguably, the student-teacher relationship can help the student understand themselves. In order for, so I've been in contact with, you might know Judy Mills, and you might know some of the work in trauma-informed practices. I've been in contact with her, and what we know is that the way to help children heal from trauma is through relationship. Now, I've said relationship at least a dozen times now, but what is a healthy relationship? What defines one? What are the variables that make a relationship helpful to students? And that's what I've spent many years thinking about. So in order for a relationship to help a child, it has to have 3 ingredients. And this is what I've kind of been thinking about, as I said before. One way to think about it is that children develop their capacity to manage and control their emotional experience, their resiliency, heal from trauma through self-esteem. We can think of self-esteem perhaps as a broader concept than just how we feel about ourselves in the moment. Self-esteem, we can think of it as the glue that holds children together. In a coming slide, I write about how self-esteem is very, very similar to self-worth. But let's think of self-esteem as a very broad sense of self. Harvard theorist named Richard Geist writes that self-esteem actually helps people know what day and time it is, helps them know their time and space. During the COVID-19, how many of us experienced Blur's Day, right? We didn't know what day it was. Maybe you've heard this expression. Thinkers such as Geist would say that's because it altered our relationships. And relationships are the most important thing. In order for a relationship to help a student regulate their emotions, there's 3 chief ingredients. And those 3 ingredients are healthy idealization, respect, admiration for the adult. What I mean by that isn't respect in the adult in an authoritative manner. No, I mean look up to the adult's capacity to care for him or her, to be there for the student. That's healthy idealization. The second ingredient is empathy. Empathy is super duper important. And empathy can be really, really complex. I'm happy to talk about empathy. And Dr. Woolard suggested maybe that should be the talk of this lecture. But I wanted to just give folks an overall framework to begin to understand these ideas. But empathy is the second ingredient. And empathy is thinking, feeling, sensing, imagining someone else's perspective. I know, Dr. Woolard, you have done this with many of your students who are on the autistic spectrum, that they can't tell you what they need. It requires the person to really be in tune, imagine, sense, in that closeness, the closeness that we have maybe with many of our children if we're in a parenting role. The third ingredient that children require, the relationship has to have in order for the child to develop their self-esteem, is belonging. They need to feel a sense of belonging and closeness. And we write about and think about how schools can develop belonging. Schools, I think, can often be outstanding places to belong. I was kidding with Dr. Woolard about today I get to be a Ram. Go Rams. People want to belong to, in my book, I think the Otters and Rams, I think every mascot I've ever worked with, it's good to be a Ram. You don't want to belong to your therapist, to the treatment center, to the hospital. That's not where you want to belong to. But schools are very good at belonging. In a difficulty with COVID-19 school closures, was so many of our students lost that place to belong. They lost their intellectual home, maybe. Perhaps they lost access to a safe adult that they didn't have outside of the schoolhouse. And these are all things that we thought about. The American Academy of Pediatrics thought about this too. How can we help these students? But those are the 3 ingredients children need in order to develop self-esteem. It's not on the slide, and I fear that Dr. Woolard will ask me to stop talking about this, but I would say that school violence, reactive school violence, has in it those 3 ingredients backwards. That school violence has empathy, belonging, and idealization. backwards. And then when students aren't provided those ingredients in a healthy way, they can often look for them in a negative way. But yeah, Dr. Woolard, if you don't mind, our next slide here.
Sure.
Self-esteem equals self-worth. I am worth the investment of learning how to regulate my emotions and my behaviors. Or this is fun. My teacher is somebody important. My teacher likes me, so maybe I can be somebody important too. Right? If the student doesn't think that faculty member has the capacity or willingness or care to help them, then empathy doesn't work. You have to want what that other person has, in the simplest sense. Yeah. Idealization. Students expect adults to be able to care for them. We're supposed to look up to the adult's capacity to care for them. And the best example of this is often kindergarten. The kindergarten teacher, maybe I'm speaking to a kindergarten teacher, you can do everything. Okay, the student asks you, how do I get to the moon? Easy, rocket ship. Okay, you know how to do it. How do I, what's the best way to get from here to Arizona? Easy, airplane. Okay, you know how to do it, right? Students naturally look up to the kindergarten teachers, right? And the teachers in the student's mind can be like firefighters. We feel safe when the firefighter's there because the firefighter can put out the fire. That students need to have a healthy look up to their teachers in a healthy way because of the teacher's ability to instruct and care for them. I've given this lecture many different places. It's been different. It's different for you Virginians, but sometimes I've done this presentation. I've asked everyone to think of one person in their life who was important in their development. Just one person. Write down the person's name. And I have asked hundreds and hundreds of people this question. And it's never not been someone that they looked up to, who was empathic, who they felt understood them, or they felt a closeness, or what we might say a sense of belonging to. It's funny, I've asked many school teachers, and surprisingly, many school teachers I've asked have mentioned teachers, that teachers were the ones that helped them develop their sense of self-worth. So healthy idealization, yeah. Okay, so you're so smart, Dr. K. That's what the kids call me. Easier said than done. How do I do it in my classroom? I got 15 kids, maybe 20 kids. I don't know. How do I do it? Well, this is where my research and Dr. Woolard's research dovetails from different directions. But what I think, the way you can increase this healthy sense of the students looking up to your capacity to care for them is by having really clear expectations, really clear routines, schedules, really clear rules of what's acceptable. What do we do here? And also clear generational boundaries where the students, the adults don't tell students too much information, TMI. The adults stay in their role. And also authenticity. You can't look up to somebody, I think, if that person's being phony. Kids know it. They know if you're going through the motions. They know it. If they've been traumatized, they have to know it because that's the way they survive. But the idea is that authenticity and real. And then on the one hand, I think that this is cutting edge science. On the other hand, it is common sense. It's not that complex, right? And I tell teachers, trust your judgment, trust who you are. Actually, trusting your judgment is a part of an evidence-based practice. Maybe we can talk about that later, but So I would say that structure, predictability are wonderful things because they allow the student to look up to the adult's capacity to care for them. And Dr. Woolard, if I can put you on a spot, you and I were discussing this last week or the week before, and you had a different perspective that I thought was just brilliant. The structure is also necessary, especially for some of the students that you work with. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know an evidence-based practice for kids with ASD is visual supports, visual schedules, visual structure. And that is certainly something that will help to reduce anxiety and allow our kids to really know what's going to happen next within their schedule. But one of the things that I realized that kind of happened since we've had the COVID pandemic is that kids came back into school and teachers kind of operated as they had before. They created their student schedule for the day. And there were some kids that had some struggles. So maybe these are first grade students that they're supporting, and these kids never had a chance to experience any type of kindergarten within a school building. Maybe they missed part of their preschool time, so they didn't have opportunities to practice things like transitions. So we know within a predictable schedule, we have to have kids that understand what a transition is. So they can finish an activity or leave an activity that's unfinished, then move to another activity, either at their same desk or at a different place in the classroom or at a different place in the school building. So we had kids that came back to school in August and September that had never, ever had to transition, never had to do anything different other than sit in front of a computer or at one desk. And so one of the things that we also realized was that they lack those prerequisite learning to learn skills. So sometimes as teachers, as we're creating those routines and schedules, we really have to look at the student's behavior and determine, are we expecting them to do something that maybe is not part of their current repertoire? Do we need to go in and actually teach them skills so that those routines can be a little bit more successful and a little bit more fluid and seamless? So I think those evidence-based practices that we know to be good for kids with autism are amazing, but sometimes we might have to take a step back and maybe do a little tweak here and there based on some of those prerequisite skills that our kids just never had the opportunity to learn. So, and I'd like to add like one more thing on the last bullet point. So just being real with the student and being true to the student and authentic. One of the things that's kind of one of my biggest pet peeves is when I go into a classroom and I'm asking a teacher, like, how are things going? Tell me how things are going. And they start talking about the student in front of the student, assuming that the student doesn't understand what they're talking about. And so I usually don't respond to conversations like that. Usually I'll redirect them to another kind of topic, and then later have a conversation with them and say, I know you think your student may not understand what you're saying, but I bet your student probably does. So I think a trusting relationship is one where we're not talking about students in front of them and saying the bad things that they're doing or the things that they should be doing instead. Oh, I'm going to unmute you. I don't know why it's doing that. I'm going to try.
I am worthy of having an adult who knows what they are doing. I couldn't agree more with not talking about a student like that in front of them. It's not dignified, and it doesn't protect a student's dignity. I'm worth having to know. Empathy. Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, thank you. Children need empathy to develop self-esteem. And what does empathy look like? Empathy is taking on the other person's perspective. It's imagining, sensing, feeling, and thinking what it's like for the other student. And empathy can also be a form of data collection, what we're doing is we're trying to understand, and then we develop a hypothesis. If I'm trying to be empathic to someone, that person is the only one that can tell me if I'm right or not. That empathy is about closeness and trying to really understand the other person.
Mhm.
One way of thinking about challenging behaviors, this is a relatively new way of thinking about it from UCLA, is that when a student's challenging behavior always has two pieces. Now, when you say always, I think it can be tricky. What's always, right? But the thinking is that it always is a way to get rid of a bad feeling. And if the student behaves in a way, it's always a way for the adult to understand the student. It's an attempt at closeness. I'm not sure that's completely right, but it's a different way of looking at disruptive behavior. And next slide, please, Dr. Woolard.
Yep. So let me just kind of like piggyback on that just a little bit, because I love, I like the concept and talking about empathy. It's one of my favorite things. But I think one of the most, the ways that we can really demonstrate that we're being empathic to a student is to understand like why they're acting in the way that they're acting, and maybe kind of go into their own perspective of why maybe they're having an outburst in the classroom. And you're right, it generally is to gain access to something or to get away from something that they don't want. So I think when we think about communication strategies for people with autism, we definitely need to be more empathic. And then when we look at empathy as data collection, there are some projects that the Virginia Department of Education is actually currently working on right now. And one is to create, we're a standards-based state. So we have standards for math and we have standards for reading, but we're actually coming up, the state is coming up with standards for social and emotional learning. And so that is a document that will probably be out in the next couple of months. It's called SHARE. It's going to be titled Social and Emotional Learning, Self-Health and Relationship Education. So for those of you who are in Virginia schools, kind of be on the lookout for that, because it will be a way for us to look at standards and then create data collection systems around it as well.
When working with children that are really struggling, I tell staff, and I try to model it, don't use the word you. You look angry. You must be frustrated. Don't even say you separates. Maybe use language, how awful. That's crummy. Imagining that you're the voice for the student. You think I'm mad? I'll show you mad. No, don't even use the word you. And we can also demonstrate empathy through mirroring. Match a child's smile with a smile. Those are some ways to think about empathy. One way to think about empathy is if you say at least, then it's not empathic. Well, at least I didn't give you more homework. At least this didn't happen. At least you, that's not empathic. And I have consulted in schools and worked in mental health since '97, and I am amazed at how often an empathic stance can really reduce affect and really help a student sit down and get to the tough business of learning. In its most simplicity, empathy is I'm worth being known and understood. The child seeks that. Empathy is also directly related to violence, but that's another lecture. But the thinking, or another presentation, however we say it in Virginia, I'm in New Hampshire. The idea would be violence forces the other person to take your perspective, forces it, and we want to avoid that, of course, at all costs.
Mm-hmm.
And the third variable is belonging. Belonging is a sense of closeness and similarity. Vendor Heidi is a thinker, And she writes that children are like kangaroos, and kangaroos need to be with other kangaroos. She's a child therapist. Oh, thank you. How can we develop a sense of belonging? How can we help people feel human in a human world where they are understood? And what we find is that when schools really think about belonging, incidences of behavioral difficulties, violence. My original research was based on how to prevent catastrophic gun violence. And what I stumbled upon was the variables that I think help prevent that also are the variables that help children develop affect tolerance, their ability to feel feelings without feelings breaking them or ruling them, or what some theorists might say, that these big feelings shatter them and they have this sense of fragmentation. So because they feel fragmented, they act out in these ways. Where if self-esteem is the glue, if self-esteem is like a well that holds someone together, I would say violence is like duct tape. It doesn't hold people. It's a temporary fix. And then children, most of the children I work with, feel awful after having done something like that. They don't feel good about it. But belonging is the third big variable. How can we have kids feel like they belong? Oh yeah, and when someone feels a closeness, a belonging, and empathically attuned, way less violent, way safer. Everyone's happy, right? And children are at their best when they experience themselves as like us. There's a similarity. And the way we get that is through emotional closeness and shared experience. When I taught group therapy, I often would use a film called The Breakfast Club. I don't know if you've seen it. I'm dating myself, but it's a film about high school students that come together. And at a certain point in the film, you can see the actors emulating a closeness and where they become a club, if you will. I work with a group of emotionally disturbed. That's the IDA language that we use, although I don't like it. Kids with challenging behaviors. And they, in the class, they call it the wolf pack. They are wolves and they get along. And this is, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. This fits with people who have suffered from trauma. Absolutely need this sense of belonging. One way to think about trauma is, there's many ways to think about it. One way to think about trauma is it destroys the child's imagination that things are a-okay. It takes away that, I don't know if I should say this, I can't read your face, but I was going to make a joke about Santa Claus. The idea would be that it robs children of their childhood, but then it also separates them from the children who still believe in Santa Claus, who still, not that everyone does, that still believe that the world is a certain way. It separates them. And so belonging and having that closeness is vitally important to children who have been exposed to trauma. Anna Ornstein, a writer and thinker she survived Auschwitz at age 13. And then she went to Hungary and became a psychiatrist. And she's a brilliant author. And she writes about trauma. And what she writes is trauma and ACEs are terrible. But what's worse is if a child doesn't have access to an adult who can provide these three very human and natural ingredients. If you're a parent, I know that you do this naturally, and so a lot of my work is to try to invite teachers to hold these concepts in their mind. And thank you, Dr. Monday. The next slide.
Advance the slide. It's not going. I've been trying to advance.
Technical difficulty.
Really sure why. Let's try this. No.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah.
The idea would be belonging is vital. I am worthy of a membership of the group. Now, what I've done is perhaps I've misled all of you, and I apologize for that, because what I've done is I've attempted to talk about these variables separately. And I wrote a textbook on this, but what we know is they're not separate. You don't want to belong to a school you don't like, that you can't look up to. You don't want to. Belonging, healthy idealization, and empathy are all intertwined. They're connected. They're all parts of the same dog, the tail, the teeth, the mouth. They're all intertwined, and it's very, very difficult to tease them out, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to advance the slide. I'm going to try.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. So originally, some of this work came from a project that I and Dr. Chris Borjowski, he a behavioral neurologist at Dartmouth, and Erica Young created to help schools in our region be sensitive to these relational needs after we reopened from COVID-19, because we thought that, yes, we thought that kids may really struggle when they return. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to figure out how schools could better repair some of these relational needs that were disrupted from school closures. I'll let you speak to the data collection and repairing empathy, Dr. Woolard, because I know that you've got a system and you're doing some pretty innovative things, as I understand.
Well, I'll say in Virginia, we do have a couple different things that are kind of in play, where schools are sending out climate surveys to students and to parents and to teachers to kind of gauge where folks are in terms of what they think needs to be in place within educational settings. So I know that we have that, and then we have the new standards for social and emotional learning that the Virginia Department of Education is working on. And then there are some schools in Virginia that actually have a social and emotional curriculum that is built into each and every day for students. So in some of the divisions that I support, it's actually part of a morning meeting where they're using some restorative practices as well to kind of embed social and emotional development and meet kids' needs. So that is one thing that we have seen, and I think there's certainly more to do to kind of gather data in that area and to assess student growth in those areas.
Thank you. How can schools repair healthy idealization? How can we help to advance a sense of belonging, a sense of closeness? The way we increase these things are through predictable environments, the things that the ACE literature has done an outstanding job outlining. And then how can we further enhance students' sense of belonging and closeness and togetherness? I have been speaking now for, I think, nearly 40 minutes. Dr. Woolard, is it okay if we invite people to ask questions now?
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions? Does this sound like malarkey? What do you, anybody?
Stacey, were there any questions that came up in the chat that we need to address?
There were no questions, a lot of great comments. One was, I believe children with ASD struggle with belonging, particularly because they struggle with initiation in social situations and responding to another person's initiation. Another comment is, I agree with Jennifer, and Jennifer said, this is such a great perspective and information I would love to see taught in every school, especially special education settings. Building relationships, trust is #1 to success, in my opinion. I couldn't agree more.
Absolutely.
But feel free to ask any questions.
Yeah. what we found is that when children don't meet these needs, the emotions can be too powerful for them, and they can behave aggressively, pushing the student all the way to the horrific, catastrophic aggression. And that was kind of the thinking behind this. And I've introduced these concepts to schools in Vermont and New Hampshire, and I found that people generally like these ideas. Yes, exactly. A close second family. They want these relationships. They seek them. They seek them out. One way I think about it is the Dennis and Menace effect. Does anyone know Dennis the Menace? He pestered Mr. Wilson. He clearly wanted a relationship with Mr. Wilson. There was something that he wanted from him. And our students, rather than thinking about some of their disruptive behavior, one way, I wonder if it's an attempt at closeness. Can you provide an example? Oh, went away. Let me click it. Maybe. Can you provide an example of the social emotional teaching that may be relayed in a morning meeting? Absolutely. Were you going to speak, Dr. Woolard?
No, you can go ahead. I'll piggyback on you.
Yeah. So what we've done in morning meetings in our neck of the woods, we might call them ESTs. If you're talking about a meeting with adults, or if you're talking about a meeting with students, meetings with adults, what we do, what is this? What's the behavior the student is doing? How can we hypothesize what's the meaning behind that behavior, and how can we engage relationally? With students. Thank you. So if the student is having a misbehavior, which is it? Can the teacher imagine which of the three ingredients the student is needing? Does the student look up to the teacher? Does the student need an empathic stance, or does the student really need a sense of belonging? And then you develop a hypothesis. Which one of those three? And my book outlines this. So it's bad taste to say buy the book, but I write how to do this. Then what interventions could you do does the student need a job? I don't know the age of the students. Does the student need a job? Does the student need a ritual? Does the student need to develop their sense of mission and belonging in the classroom? Our program has established rituals and routines. However, at times we serve students who refuse. Right. So why do they refuse to follow routines? It comes from anger and mistrust. Yes. So this is a wonderful question. What are some strategies to help them bring to trust the school staff when the student knows? Okay, this is a wonderful question. The way that I think about it is, if the student if the student is refusing to do something, right? I'm refusing to feed the goldfish. Is it possible to imagine the student's perspective in language why they don't want to refuse it? Why do you imagine they want to refuse? Is it because if they do it, it makes them a fool? If they do it, does it make them, can they not allow you to care for them because it makes them a fool, because they're going to go away and they don't want to be heartbroken? I wonder if feeding the goldfish, there's one way to think about it. I'm not telling you to do this, but it's a way to think about it. Is feeding the goldfish a sign of heartbreak? If I feed the goldfish, it means I have a place to belong here, and this wonderful place is going to be taken from me, and it's going to make me too sad. Is it I can't feed the goldfish because I don't trust you, because I can't trust the other adults in my life? And by golly day, the other adults in my life have given me many, many reasons not to trust you. Is it belonging? I am a Woolard. I'll pick on you, Dr. Woolard. I am a Woolard, and I don't like school. My daddy didn't like school. My mommy didn't like school. We don't like the school. We're not friends with the school. And I'm going to do what my mom and dad say, which is not to do what you say. So then it's a question of belonging. Who do they trust? So you can take the refusal to do something, and I would wonder, and it would be a blast if we could do this together. Wonder with you, what is the relational ingredient they're wanting you to know? What is it? And what I find is that it may take a while, but when students, often it really unlocks students and enables them to participate in ways we didn't think they could. Any other questions? I know of.
So I'll tell you kind of an example. It's very much simplified from where you were, but in one of the elementary schools that I was in recently, they had a morning meeting and they had students that were really struggling with a very basic skill of sharing. And I think it was based on, the fact that during COVID, nobody was sharing materials. Nobody was allowed to touch a material or a book that another student had touched without it being wiped down. And so the lesson was very simple about sharing, and they used behavior skills training to really discuss what sharing looked like and what it didn't look like. And then the teacher modeled it, what it looked like and didn't look like. And then the students practiced what sharing looked like. So I know what my example is much more basic and kind of foundational, I guess. But those are the ways that teachers are kind of responding to teaching some of those social skills in the classroom that kids just did not have an opportunity to learn before.
Thank you. I've got more questions here. What is a good example of social emotional morning meeting for a kindergarten class? If the students can't tolerate a morning meeting, then I wonder if they need more one-on-one adult time, if they need to have that sense of self, and they need teachers to really connect with them. I know I hear myself poorly answering your question, but the idea would be, is it possible for an adult to meet the student's relational needs? And do you feel these are the same at home? Home is different than school, I think, for sure. There's a famous pediatrician who writes, the best parents ever are good parents 30% of the time. And his notion was the good enough parent. When it says, my children seem to respond to teachers and therapists, but are resistant to similar approaches at home. Generally, as a child, go ahead, Dr. Woolard.
So, I can address that from a behavioral standpoint. So we would, that's actually most likely a generalization issue. So many kids learn skills in one environment, and some of them will generalize or transfer that skill into the other environment very easily, or with different people or with different sets of materials. Some kids need to have very structured instruction on how to generalize or demonstrate that skill in another setting. And the reason is pretty simple. Some of the environmental variables are different from a home setting to a school setting. So looking at those approaches, just kind of thinking about that and just making sure things are similar. So both settings are very different.
It was a wonderful activity in the chat that talks about how to think with students about some of these relational needs during morning meetings.
And I will say there was a question about routines and students really not wanting to follow routines. And I would really ask people to make sure that your students understand what the routine is and what's being asked of them, and that they actually have the skills to do that. Because I've seen many kids that teachers think they're being non-compliant, and maybe they are, I'm not sure, in following a very simple routine, but their executive functioning skills are not really at a point where they're able to organize and plan through that entire routine. And I'm thinking even like middle schoolers, when a teacher has a lesson that they're teaching and they haven't necessarily finished the lesson, but they're asking the students to transition to something else. A lot of these kids are having a hard time wrapping up whatever activity that they're doing and moving on to the next activity and doing it seamlessly.
So what I would say, Dr. Woolard, is your example is one of empathy. Can you imagine why the student might be struggling with that? I had oppositional in regards to oppositional disorder. I had a student tell me today, he said, Dr. K, I've got a question. I was like, what's that? He's like, is it crazy not to do what crazy people tell you to do? Because my family are telling me to do things that are not in my best interest. And then we talked about it. And he then later said, it's tough because I had to learn at school that the teachers do have my best interest at heart. And they do. It was tough for me. He said my automatic was a no. And I'm not saying that applies to all of your students, but that's something that came up to me. Do you see much involvement with parents in their input ideas to help students with routines and strategies? Dr. Woolard, is it okay if I field this?
Sure.
It depends. What we strive for is real transparency with our social emotional goals and programs with parents. And I'm happy to include their input. And I'm happy to be a team and have parents collaborate with families on how they can work together with schools. We work very closely with some of our families. My job is similar to yours, Dr. Woolard, but I work in much fewer schools. So my catchment, if you will, I think is much smaller. So I have the opportunity to really get to know some of the families in our school divisions very well.
I think one of the nice things that kind of happened from, I guess one of the positive things that happened after COVID-19 was that I have seen that there's been more collaboration with families and schools. A lot of parents became their students' teacher during the pandemic. And so I think there was just a lot more opportunities for collaboration. So I think that we're seeing that increase with some students, some schools as well. Okay.
Oh, no, go ahead. Any other questions? I very much so want to answer them. It has been an honor to have a moment of your time, and thank you so much. I hope it's okay, Stacy, but for the past hour, I felt like a ram. And I'm very pleased, and I'm just delighted to be here. And thank you so much for your time. And I hope what I said may be of some interest to you. If you have questions, my contact is in this slide. I'm very hard to get a hold of, but I return all my emails and phone calls. And thank you, everyone, for having your Thursday lunch with me.
So,
Thank you very much, everybody. I'm so sorry. My dog is barking in the background. But what a wonderful way of thinking about interacting with students differently. I think a lot of times we're so excited and driven to teach the academics, teach all those skills, and we forget about building that relationship first, which could really kind of elevate the way students learn. So I really appreciate you both taking the time talking about this. And just as a reminder, everybody, the recording, the PowerPoint, and the transcript will be on our archived Lunch and Learn website, and that's in the chat. And again, thank you both so very much.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Go Rams. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Take care, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your week.